Guys, this will be our first video for APUSH for Thursday, April 30th. We'll be wrapping up Unit 7 from the course guidebook and mostly wrapping up all of the video notes we needed to have before the test. Alright, second New Deal. Not everyone, however, was enamored with the New Deal. In fact, both ends of the political spectrum criticized Roosevelt. Conservatives opposed the higher tax rates that the New Deal brought. They also disliked the increase in government power over business, and they complained that relief programs removed the incentive for poor to lift themselves out of poverty. Additionally, the government had to borrow to finance all of its programs, and its deficit spending was anathema to conservatives. Leftists complained that the AAA policy of paying farmers not to grow was immoral, given that many Americans are still too poor to feed themselves. They also felt the government policy towards businesses was too favorable. They wanted more punitive measures, as many on the left blamed of corporate greed for the Depression. The despair caused by the Depression provided fodder for a more radical left, and the socialists, to a lesser extent the Communist Party of America, were gaining popularity by calling for the nationalization, that is, a takeover of the government of business. Then in 1935, the Supreme Court started to dismantle some of the programs of the first New Deal in a series of cases, one of which came to be known as the Chicken Case. Secretary Poultry Corporation versus U.S. invalidated sections of the NIRA on the grounds that the codes created under the agency were unconstitutional. According to the Constitution, only Congress can make laws. However, the NIRA empowered an agency within the executive branch of government to set wage and price ceilings, maximum work hours, and regulations regarding labor unions. The court ruled that these codes were in effect executive legislation and beyond the limits of executive power. Roosevelt had argued that, like war, the Great Depression had created a national crisis that warranted the expansion of the executive branch of government. The following year, the Supreme Court struck down the AAA in the United States versus Butler. Roosevelt responded by attempting to pack the court with justices who supported his policies. The size of the Supreme Court had changed a few times since its creation, but Roosevelt's attempt to increase the size of the court from 9 justices to 15, giving him the power to pick justices whose views he liked, was too much for Democrats, let alone Republicans. As a result, the court packing scheme, or court packing bill, was rejected by Congress. Roosevelt then continued with a package of legislation called the Second New Deal. First, he established the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act, which created the Works Progress Administration, WPA, whose name was later changed to the Works Project Administration. The WPA generated more than 8 million jobs, all paid for by the government, along with public work projects such as construction. The WPA also employed writers, photographers, and other artists to create travel guides and to record local and personal histories. The summer of 35 is often called Roosevelt's second 100 days because the amount and importance of legislation passed in is comparable to that of the first 100 days. During this period, the Congress passed legislation that broadened the powers of the NLRB, democratized unions, and punished businesses with anti-union policies. During this time, the Congress also created the Social Security Administration to provide retirement benefits to many workers, including the disabled and families whose main breadwinner had died. Furthermore, the government increased taxes on wealthy individuals and top-end business profits. The cumulative effect of these programs led to the creation of the New Deal coalition made up of union members, urbanites, and underclass, and blacks. This new Democratic coalition swept Roosevelt back into office with a landslide victory in 1936 and held together until the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Roosevelt's troubled second term. Several programs marred Franklin Roosevelt's second term. The first major failure of his presidency came as the term began. Angry that the Supreme Court had overturned much of the first New Deal, and worried that the same fate awaited the second New Deal, Roosevelt drafted a judicial reorganization bill. The bill proposed that Roosevelt be allowed to name a new federal judge for every sitting judge who had reached the age of 70 and had not retired. If passed, it would have allowed Roosevelt to add 6 new Supreme Court justices and more than 40 other federal judges. A not-so-subtle effort at packing the court with judges more sympathetic to Roosevelt's policies. The bill was soundly defeated in the Democratic Congress, and Roosevelt came under intense criticism for trying to seize too much power. Ultimately, the court situation worked itself out to Roosevelt's benefit. A number of justices retired not long after the incident, and Roosevelt was able to replace them with more liberal judges. In 1937, the economy went into a recession, a period of continually decreasing output. The cause was twofold. Roosevelt, satisfied the New Deal was doing its job, cut back government programs in an effort to balance the budget. At the same time, the Federal Reserve Board tightened the credit supply in an effort to slow inflation. Both actions took money out of circulation, resulting in a slower economy. The recession lasted for almost 3 years and caused a substantial increase in the unemployment rate. To top off Roosevelt's second term in 1938, it was becoming evident that Europe might soon be at war again. The situation forced Roosevelt to withdraw some money from the New Deal programs in order to fund military buildup. The administration succeeded in passing the second AAA that met the standards set by the Supreme Court's rejection of the first AAA. It also secured the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set a minimum wage and established a 40-hour work week for a number of professions. Not long after this, however, the New Deal came to an end. Did the New Deal work? Historians like to debate this question. Those who argue yes point to many people who escaped life-threatening poverty because of government assistance, and especially to the immediate relief provided by the first New Deal. They also point to many reforms of banking, finance, and management, union relations. In these areas, the New Deal were made American in ways that are still recognizable today. Finally, proponents of the New Deal argued that Roosevelt should be praised for taking bold chances in a conservative political climate. He risked new initiatives when he was clear that old solutions were failing. On the other hand, those who assert the New Deal failed can point to the unemployment rate, which remained in double digits throughout the New Deal. Conservative historians argue that the New Deal thus did not solve the unemployment problem. Some on the left agree, contending the New Deal was too small and too short-lived. Look at how unemployment began to spike in 1937 when Roosevelt took his foot off the gas, and that wasn't until the truly massive deficit spending program put in place in response to World War II that the economy began to eventually recover. Furthermore, today's social welfare system stems from the New Deal. Those who feel the current American system has failed can point to Roosevelt as the man who started it all. Lastly, the New Deal did not benefit all equally. Minorities in particular reaped fewer and sometimes no benefits. The AAA actually hurt blacks and tenant farmers by putting them out of work. Some of the public works projects underhired blacks, and almost all were segregated. So that's wrapping up the New Deal. Now we're looking at foreign policy leading into World War II. In the decade that followed World War I, American foreign policy objectives were aimed primarily at promoting and maintaining peace and had been described as independent internationalism rather than isolationism. The Washington Conference gathered 8 of the world's great powers. The resulting treaty set limits on the stockpile of armaments and reaffirmed the open door policy in China. In 1928, 62 nations signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which condemned war as a means of federal foreign policy. Although it contained no enforcement clauses, the Kellogg-Briand Pact was widely considered a great first step towards the post-war age. In Latin America, the United States tried to back away from its previous interventionist policy and replace it with a good neighbor policy. In 1934, the name, however, is misleading. The United States continued to actively promote its interests in Latin America, often to the detriment of those who lived there. However, the Platt Amendment was repealed this time. The United States achieved its foreign policy objectives mainly through economic coercion and support of pro-American leaders, some of whom were corrupt and brutal. The United States also figured out how to maintain a strong but less threatening military presence in the area, both by paying for the privilege of maintaining military bases in the countries and by arranging to train the nation's National Guard units. In Asia, the United States had less influence. Consequently, when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and violating the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the League of Nations was powerless and the American government could do little. When Japan went to war against China in 1937, the United States sold arms to the Chinese and called for an embargo on arms sales to Japan. However, fearful of provoking a war with Japan, the government did not order an embargo on commercial shipments to Japan from the United States. Throughout the Republican administration in the 1920s, the U.S. government kept tariffs high. This policy is called protectionism. Early in Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, the government devised a method of using economic leverage as a foreign policy tool. The reciprocal trade agreements allowed the president to reduce tariffs if he felt doing so would achieve foreign policy goals. Countries granted Most Favored Nation (MFN's) trade status were eligible with the lowest tariff rate set by the United States if they played their cards right. MFN trade status remained a foreign policy tool today. Disenchantment with the results of World War I fed isolationist sentiment, a stance amplified by the findings of the Nye Commission. Led by Senator Gerald Nye, the Commission's report in 1936 revealed unwholesome activities by American arms manufacturers. Many had lobbied intensely for entry into World War I. Others had bribed foreign officials, and still others were currently supplying fascist governments with weapons. Congress responded by passing a series of neutrality acts. The first Neutrality Act, 1935, prohibited the sale of arms to either belligerent country in a war. Roosevelt sidestepped this act in 1937, sale of arms to China by simply refusing to acknowledge that China and Japan were at war. The Second Neutrality Act banned loans to belligerents as well. All the while, Roosevelt poured money into the military just in case. As it became more apparent that Europe was headed for war, Roosevelt lobbied for a repeal of the arms embargo stated in the First Neutrality Act so that America could help with the arm the Allies, mostly England and France. When the war broke out, Congress relented with a Third Neutrality Act, which allowed arms sales and would in return cash and carry. It required the Allies to, number one, pay cash for the weapons, and two, come to the United States to pick them up for their purchases and carry them away themselves. From the outset of the war until America's entry in 1941, Roosevelt angled the country towards participation, particularly when Poland fell to German troops and other countries followed in rapid succession. In 1940, Hitler invaded France, and a German takeover of both France and England appeared a real possibility. The chance that America might soon enter the war convinced Roosevelt to run for an unprecedented third term. Again, he won convincingly.